It is my great pleasure to welcome the next speaker, and as he requested, I'm going to keep this short and sweet. What I'd like to do is introduce and welcome to the stage Mr. John Sheridan. He is here from Canberra, and he's here to help.
I think the story of 2012 is people would rather drink coffee than listen to government. So I hope I can adjust that for you now. People ask us what the government's policy is on cloud, and I like to think of it as a dry as a bone policy. It's a policy for Australia, designed in Australia. It encourages the use of Australian IT. It takes into account that if you go out in the clouds, sometimes you're going to get wet, and you need to take appropriate precautions to do that. But the precautions that you take need to be such that you can take them off if it gets dry. And that's the nature of a dry as a bone policy. It's Australian, it takes into account the circumstances, and as the circumstances change, you can do something about them. And I'm going to talk to you about today where we see the circumstances at the moment and where we see them going. Firstly, you've heard this morning a lot about what clouds are made of. I think it's important to note that we're doing things using cloud technology now. It's fashionable to call it cloud technology, but some of these things have been around for a while. Take virtualisation. The Australian government's use of virtualisation has improved threefold since 2007-2008. We're running across the government at about three servers per physical server. The Gartner worldwide ratio is about 1.9, so we're ahead of the game in that regard. Now, we're not running 60 servers a core or anything like that at the moment because there are horses for courses, but we are making use of virtualisation now and will continue to do so. Secondly, we're reducing the costs of carriage of data between our data centres. Our coordinated procurement requirements that we've had in place now for just over a year have reduced the cost of carriage with major ISPs from up to 50 to 60 to almost 70% using the same carriers and the same circumstances. When you increase competition and cloud increases competition, you save money. The competition in the desktop hardware space has reduced the amount that the government is paying for PCs from 56% above the Australian average to more than 55% below the Australian average in about 18 months. We're buying desktop PCs at the same price as the US professional market now. And what does that mean? It means that some of those ideas about VDI and things like that that we saw before, we can already consider in a better total cost of ownership means than just rushing to the cloud in order to do things. It doesn't mean that we don't want to use the cloud. It means that these existing technologies can make us smarter about how we buy IT in our own or in other data centres now before we get into the benefits of cloud. Now let's look at what makes it cloudy. These are the principles in the Australian government's cloud strategy, and they're drawn from the NIST principles in the US. It's about elasticity, scalability, pay-as-you-go, and running things across public infrastructure. That's how you get the benefits of the public cloud particularly. Now, the challenge for us is to understand that the cloud isn't the only way to buy IT. As you heard, there's opportunities to use these technologies in our existing data centres. And indeed, we would be silly not to use those technologies in our existing data centres. And that's the move we have towards adjusting these things. It doesn't necessarily have to just be about the cloud. Now, what do we get from clouds? What we get is an ability to do more faster and to do it for longer than we have otherwise achieved. And this is an important arrangement because of the changes that the value-added ability of clouds provide us with. If we use them properly, we can get new business models, we can get to market faster, and we can reduce the costs. And the government's cloud policy brings all these things into account. It's that change, the way we want, about what we want to do things. The notion of getting the common part of IT done in a common way, in a commoditised way, so your internal IT staff can concentrate on the things that differentiate your agency. And that's the goal of all our technology changes, not just cloud. Now, it's important to note that for Australia, using the cloud isn't just about ticking the iCloud box on your iPad. There are more considerations around that than that. We have a range of international treaties that affect how we use IT and what we need to do about them. We've got issues of Australian industry development to take into account. If IT is the new economic driver for the world, why would we necessarily want to export that economic driver overseas? Aren't there opportunities in Australia that we could see these things being done if it provides value for money for the government? And that's the important driver. We need to think about data sovereignty. We all know about the Patriot Act, and yes, there are some issues around that, but what we don't know are about how other governments in which data centres might be stored, that might be held, that put things in the cloud. What are their rules about these things? As I said, we know about the Patriot Act, we know what it says. We can take those things into account. But what about data centres that are in other countries, lesser democracies? How do we manage those sorts of concerns, and what do we think about doing there? Not to be frightened, but to be aware of what we do with government technology and government data. Now, we know already that some things are ready to move now into the cloud. To give you an example, and this is a page drawn from our cloud strategy, our cloud framework. To give you an example, I look after data.gov.au. The front page, if you like, the entry for data.gov.au is an outsourced data centre by a partner of ours, a private business, running not their data centre but someone else's data centre in Sydney. The back end is in the Amazon cloud. Why is this the case? Because the 1,000-odd data sets that will be in data.gov.au soon are designed specifically to be provided to the public. It makes no sense to lock them up securely where no one can get them. It makes sense to put them in a place where we can take the benefit of the cloud, get the flexibility that allows, the scalability that allows. People can all go and look at the data at once if that's what's required, and it reduces our costs. Now, there's going to be a whole bunch of things in that data arrangement, those data arrangements, that allow us to make that sort of benefits. If you think about web pages, the web pages that government provides facing people now don't usually contain secure information. They don't need to collect information about customers. And if they do, it can be through some form of hybrid cloud arrangement where the secure data can be in our secure data centres and the public-facing data can be in the public cloud, wherever that is. It's that sort of mix of value for money, of considering the whole arrangement, that's important to consider. Now, I think it's realistic to think for a moment about the state of the cloud market in Australia and how mature it is. I have to tell you that we think that it's not as mature as it's going to be. And at the moment, as a consequence, our government cloud policy talks about moving when it's appropriate to do so. Now, as the market gets more mature, we may well get a more all-encompassing strategy, but we're going to remain flexible to see what it is that develops, because we want to make sure that we're not making mistakes. Now, there are no doubt those amongst you who are saying, that means they don't want innovation in government. So I'd just like you to put up your hands if you pay taxes in Australia. Thank you very much. Just keep them up for a moment. I'll only take them down if you don't want government to have innovation. So most people want innovation. Take them down also if you don't think innovation involves risk of failure. Most people understand that innovation involves risk of failure. Now put your hand up please if you could just tell me what percentage of your taxes you'd like devoted to failure from the start. What we're seeing, of course, is what the government should naturally do with its IT is look for applied innovation. There are some things in which it's important for us to be a Type A organisation, to take the leading edge of technology. But there's a lot of things that don't require us to take the leading edge. We don't want to be the Type C organisation that's following along behind in the wake of other companies or other organisations. We want to be, I think, at the front edge of a Type B organisation. We want to be the first to be second for these things so that we understand the risks, we take into account what's occurring, we take into account what can be done, and then we move. When we're making sure that the data entrusted to us by Australians, their personal, private data, is looked after properly. And this is the notion of developing a mature industry in Australia for cloud and also making appropriate choices about when it's right to put something in the cloud and when it's right to use cloud-like technologies in our existing data centres to get the benefits that those obviously offer. And that's what our policy is about. Now, we've done some initial policy work about the sort of guidelines government should have in purchasing cloud services. And they can be broken down into these three areas: privacy, legal issues, financial considerations. Indeed, if you Google them or use another search engine of your choice, you'll be able to find, by typing in Agemo Cloud Guidelines, these policies on the web and download them very easily. Let's talk first about our privacy requirements. Now, remember that I'm not necessarily talking about public-facing web data. I'm talking about your medical records. I'm talking about other records that you might have that the government holds. The government's very careful to make sure that it doesn't allow leaking of data between agencies. Because we know that if you look at the benefits cloud computing can provide, and Amazon's a great example of this. Amazon asks me every day, would I like to buy more books on the American Civil War? And I do. They know my tastes, they know what I want to do, and they suggest them regularly, and often I take advantage of that. But let's just say we had a bit of a problem with data security in Australia, and having gone to the doctor for a sexually transmitted infection, I got an email from the Child Support Agency saying, we notice you're likely to have problems with your wife, would you like to talk to us about this now? Of course not. And this is the challenge we have in making sure we balance the data that we've got and the requirements that we have to do things properly in this area. We need to tell people what we're doing with their data, who we're going to let see it, how it's going to be used, so they understand and remain in control of it. It's because of that, those arrangements, that we need to be careful about what we do with these things. And again, we need to move to a mature market, not necessarily being at the leading edge. Now, legal issues. We've heard some of these issues already this morning, and there are a range of those that can be taken into account. It's not surprising, though, when you think about the contractual arrangements that we have with our IT providers normally, that we would not also want to have those arrangements with providers who run cloud technology in their existing data centres or cloud-like computing across the world. Now, the challenge for us again here is negotiating the things that we need to protect the sort of data and the arrangements that we have. The total Australian government user market, the public servants and Defence Force personnel who use our government computing, that's about 250,000. That's about half the size of the US Air Force computer market. How much weight do you think we're going to have with large overseas companies in changing their legal and contractual arrangements to suit our particular circumstances? Now, this isn't a criticism, it's just a blinding glimpse of reality. What we have to do is make sure that when we're venturing into these areas, we take these legal considerations into account. How do we get out of the arrangement? What do we want to do if we change how things are going? Do you think we'll have step-in rights in a cloud data centre somewhere on the west coast of the United States if a major cloud provider goes bust? I don't think so. What we need to do is make sure we understand what it is we're doing, we understand what we're entering into, and we do that with our eyes open, which is why we have these simple legal considerations to be taken into account. Now, when less is at risk, you need less protection. And I'm going to talk about a way of adjusting that or examining that in our current consultation with stakeholders in a moment. Let's look at financial considerations. Now, this slide's a bit harder to read. Why? Because savings are hard to find in government. Think of the move from CapEx to OpEx. What do you have to do with CapEx at the moment? If you've got a big spend that you need to do on an irregular basis, you've got to write a proposal to go to government in the budget cycle. Budget cycle starts in October for a delivery next Tuesday. You've got to write a proposal, you've got to fully cost the proposal, you've got to argue the proposal, you've got to get a lump of funding, and sometimes it's hard to get a lump of funding. You've got to get that in place in order to get over that bump, to build what it is you need, and then keep it running with operational expense over the next 4 or 5 years and do that bump again. Of course, in those circumstances, anything that can move you to OpEx is useful. But as anyone who knows about the efficiency dividend can understand, sometimes OpEx can be reduced in a way that you're not predicting. So you've got to take those things into account. It's not as easy as moving from one to another. You've got to take into account the total cost of ownership of these arrangements. You've got to understand what it needs to manage the contract, and of course you've got to get value for money, the overriding consideration of government procurement. And in order to make sure you're getting value for money, you need to put in place a stringent, serious, appropriate arrangement for managing risk. And it's that managing risk arrangement that is important to any procurement decision, and of course applies in the cloud arrangements. Let's look at what we're doing now to address some of these arrangements. Data centre as a service is one of the opportunities that grew out of our data centre strategy. The data centre strategy, which was launched in March 2010, was designed to address something that Sir Peter Gershon had discovered in his review of Australian government IT, which was, if we were careful about what we did with government IT in data centres over the next 10 to 15 years, we could avoid $1 billion worth of costs. We spend about spend about $870 million a year on data centres across government. Now, you need to understand just for a moment a bit of Canberra speak. $1 billion worth of avoided costs and $3.90 will get you a double-shot cappuccino on the ground floor of my building. Avoided costs means money you don't have to go to government to ask for. It isn't a saving, you can't take it out of someone's budget, but it reduces what it is you're going to spend. It's clever in terms of doing that. Now, what Sir Peter said is there's a range of ways to do this, and we've put some data centre facilities panels in place in order to get benefits, and we're seeing those benefits already. What we also want to do is address the issues of what happens when people want a quick service. What happens if they want a couple of servers worth of test and dev for 3 months to run a particular project? They don't want to run it up in their own data centre. Perhaps the data centre isn't big enough. Perhaps they don't have the skills to do that immediately. It's only a short-term project. They want to make use of a particular change or support a particular campaign. So what they need is exactly the sort of thing that the cloud was designed for. But don't hesitate to say, the cloud isn't the only way to buy these services. You can get them in existing data centres too. So what we've put out on our blog, agemo.govspace.gov.au, got to go there, is a proposal to buy services less than $80,000 for less than 1 year, because that represents reduced risk. What do these services do? Essentially what it means is they're not covered procurements, more government speak. It means they're not subject to Division 2 of the Commonwealth Procurement Guidelines, soon to be the Commonwealth Procurement Rules, but they are subject to the value for money arrangements. It means agencies can decide whether they need to get 3 quotes or 10 quotes or 2 quotes below that $80,000. They don't trigger the free trade agreement arrangements that we have that require things to go to open tender. So as a consequence, we can build up a list of suppliers. We can have a relatively low hurdle to get onto this list in a way that allows risk to be reduced. We're consulting with the public now around these things. I'm doing an industry brief tomorrow that will also be webcast. You'll be able to watch that if you like. You'll need a widescreen to fit me in, of course. We're putting in place simple contracts reflecting the fact that this is relatively cheap procurement. For $80,000, the government normally pays in arrears. We're not going to drag someone into court for $80,000. The lawyers cost too much. What we're going to do instead is say we're going to have guaranteed, or some people will sign up to this one-head agreement that says they'll go to compulsory arbitration first. Now, that doesn't stop people accessing the courts, of course, but it does mean that the courts will take a dimmer view of someone who hasn't gone through the process. And because it's for $80,000 or less, it reduces the cost that the vendors have as well in this regard. We're going to use templated documentation. Essentially, you'll be able to fill out an order form on the web, send it to the people you want quotes from. They'll be able to do the quotes. They won't have to negotiate very much because all of that will be in their head agreement or their declared service level availability. And it'll be easy to do business. Let's have a quick look at what it might look like. Perhaps a slower look. There we go. These are just examples of the characteristics that you might see. If you look carefully, you'll see a dog in the background as well. But this only worked on about 3 of the people I've shown it to so far. So if you can't see the dog, it's your problem. On the left, we've got some of the services that you've seen already. And not surprisingly, I've got some examples of what they might be. Now, we're going to be asking people to declare. We don't mind what your SLAs are if you're a vendor. We're not going to force you into a particular set of SLAs. We're going to ask you to declare what your SLAs are. What's the minimum number of units of this service you'll be able to put up? What's the maximum you can handle? How much warning time do you need to increase the service? How much do you need to decrease the service? What's your uptime arrangements? Are you promising 5 nines, 4 nines, 3 nines? Do you provide help desk service 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, or 24/7, 365? None of those things are discriminators in getting on the panel. It's just declaring what you'll do. Now, when a government user wants to look at these arrangements, they'll go to a spreadsheet, they'll tick the things they're interested in, they'll get a range of services, and according to their agency chief executive instructions, they'll be able to go and get quotes. People will come back and say, yes, I can provide that service as you've asked for this much money. And that's the arrangement that will be signed under an official order. You won't need an extensive tendering process. It won't be all that difficult to get on the panel in the first place. You'll need a couple of references, a Dun & Bradstreet check. You'll need to sign the head agreement. The head agreement won't be a negotiating thing. I mean, you can comment on it now if you want, but it won't be a negotiating thing. It'll be the head agreement. You can sign it or not sign it. There won't be mandatory use of this panel, but what we think it'll do will address the requirements of the 50 government agencies that spend less than $2 million a year on IT. How much is $2 million a year on IT? I'll find a table with 4 people on it. The guy on the right would be the exchange server guy. The next guy would be the applications guy. The next lady would look after procurement, and the guy on the left would think he was the CIO. That's how many people run for an agency with less than $2 million worth of IT spend. We need to help them in procurement. We need to make it simpler for them to take advantages of these changes, and that's what this panel arrangement is set to do. What then for the future of the cloud? Hands up if you can see USS Voyager. Only a few. Firstly, encryption. I want you to think what happened when we first had laptops. We decided we'd put secret information on them. Now, after a few months, we no longer just kept those computers in a room that we went to do secret stuff. What we did was we encrypted the hard disks of those computers so they could be taken somewhere else and used securely and then stored in a manner that wouldn't risk our information. You've got to ask yourself, and one of our earlier speakers touched on this, you've got to ask yourself how far away is secure encryption in the cloud? So that the cloud vendor, the cloud provider, but for that matter the data centre provider, it doesn't need to be in the cloud, the data centre provider can access the fact that your servers, that he's running servers for you, that she's monitoring the power and the emissions and those sorts of things, but can't see what the data is because the keys to that are stored completely somewhere else. Surely that's got to be the future of doing these sorts of things. The second is this idea of certification. You can see that in the US at the moment using their FedRAMP arrangements, which are essentially a means of addressing the problem of certification. Understanding that some data centres, some cloud providers will have better security than others. Not in a pejorative sense, but just for higher arrangements. Now we have a program in Australia that does this at the moment for physical data centres. It's called the IRAP program. You can read about it at DSD's website, and it has third-party qualified people who can go around and assess the security of your IT infrastructure. Surely that's going to happen in the cloud as well over time. Thirdly, we're going to have standardisation. What's going to happen is the IT market, as all other IT markets have moved, is going to move to a way that you can easily move things between the arrangements. We no longer have the situation, because of BYOD and other arrangements, where people are running solely Wintel shops at their offices. There are a whole range of ways of accessing company servers and those sorts of arrangements. That's clearly going to happen in these arrangements too, because when we have standardisation, we will have portability between arrangements. So it won't matter if you're in one cloud and the company tanks, you'll be able to move to another cloud and you'll be able to do so relatively easily and quickly. And then we'll get commodification, which means that we'll be able to buy this sort of IT as a commodity. And then we get to the area I like best, coordinated procurement, where we can get out and contract things for best value for money for government, using our aggregated buying power, getting more value for the taxpayers' money, and allowing us to do a bit more innovation with the change. I'm not going to talk now, take questions now. You can see the six-legged pig though. I'm happy to take questions during the panel. Thanks very much.